Well, I see we've got some space left on this tape, so I've decided to usefully fill it and introduce you to a piece of information called the loop. Now, the loop is a piece of information which gives a relationship between a postulate and what that postulate permits to be possible and what that postulate permits to be impossible. Now, the first thing you should know about the loop is that it's not peculiar to this universe. This is a general principle that will be applicable to any universe, but it's certainly applicable to this universe. Now, what it amounts to is this: that if you have a postulate, you can deduce from the postulate what is possible in the universe in terms of that postulate. And knowing what is possible in terms of that postulate in the universe, you can deduce what is impossible in the universe in terms of that postulate. And, now note the next bit, knowing what is impossible in terms of that postulate in the universe, you can deduce the postulate. So it's a loop. It's like having A, B and C, and if you know A, you can deduce B, and if you know B, you can deduce C, and if